Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another installment of the National Training Agency's TVET webinar series. I am Ms. Anisha Karud-Walcott, Senior Coordinator, NTA Tobago Office, and I will be moderating this afternoon's proceedings. Let me just take pleasure in saying that this is the first webinar that is being streamed live from Tobago. This presentation will focus on prior learning assessment and recognition, and individuals' acquired skills and knowledge, no matter how, when, or where learning occurred. The skills, knowledge, and are assessed against approved occupational standards. The use of the PLAR system will make available to industries certified workers who meet required occupational standards. Participants will be awarded the Caribbean Vocational Qualification, also known as the CVQ, upon successful completion. Now at this point, let me introduce today's speakers, Mr. Reynold John, former General Manager Training of the MIC Institute of Technology, and Mr. Kevin Lafon, Technical Officer of the National Training Agency. Without further delay, let me hand you over to these gentlemen for their presentation.
Okay. First, we would like to just express our sincere appreciation for everyone who actually took time out of their busy schedules to join us this morning for our discussion. What I would like to do this morning is maybe set the context in terms of the rationale behind why there's a need for a process such as PLAR in the context of technical vocational education and training, especially as it applies to that in terms of maybe a little historical background from Tobago. So I'd like to actually ask Mr. John just to give a little brief synopsis in terms of how things would have actually evolved over the years, leading us to this particular point where there is definitely a need for prior learning assessment and recognition. Mr. John.
Hey, good afternoon, Tobago. Good afternoon to my fellow presenters, and welcome to the session. Over the past, I would say, 50 years or so, even more, technical vocational education in Trinidad and Tobago was driven by the three then major technical institutions, San Fernando Technical, John Donaldson, and Point Fortin Vocational Centers. As a consequence, most of the people in Trinidad and in Tobago in particular will move to Trinidad to acquire the technical qualification. Subsequent to that, and I moved very quickly So about 20 years ago, when the then Ministry of Science, Technology, and Tertiary Education has in its package a philosophy on lifelong learning. And coming out of lifelong learning, prior learning assessment and recognition is the bedrock of this kind of assessment and certification. And so in the Tobago context, Tobago, as far as you know, would have hardly had opportunities for technical vocational education and training. Even with the large investment in the senior comprehensive schools in the 70s, Tobago boasts itself mainly of Signal Hill Senior Comprehensive and the Roxborough Composite. Signal Hill itself was a composite school, and so was Roxborough, because neither of these institutions, unlike their Trinidad counterparts, would have introduced the National Examination Council craft programs, and therefore Tobago was still at a deficit. Of course, over the years, we would have had the National Youth Camp in Mount St. George, Tobago, and the trade schools. They were producing persons mainly at level 1 and in some ways level 1.5 on the qualification framework, although there isn't a level 1 and 1.5, but you understand what I mean. And during all these years, Tobagonians were learning and plying their trades. I recall very vividly, electricians would wire a whole house and then look for a licensed electrician to submit the job for inspection, and so that the job could be ready for consumer use. And in that context, you have all these sets of learning non-formally, informally, that was taking place. And that brought to bear the notion of PLAR in the Tobago context. As we emphasize TVET Week in Trinidad and Tobago, this is to let the public in Tobago understand and know that there's an opportunity for persons to gain qualification through the PLAR route. This is an ideal opportunity for the thousands of young persons and not so young to acquire their qualifications through the PLAR route. My friend here, Mr. Lafon, will give a perspective on how you acquire the PLAR.
Okay, thank you, Mr. John. Basically, just to start off, in terms of talking about the actual process of PLAR, what we're actually dealing with here is really a two-part process. So the first part actually deals with the fact that these persons would have been, just as Mr. John said, have been afforded this opportunity to practice their trade over the years, acquire that experience, and a lot of learning as a result of those years of experience. So this particular process actually sets the scenario where we can now facilitate the actual documentation leading to the actual assessment and recognition of that learning that will have taken place as a result of that experience exposure. So the process, the first part is really the PLA, which is really the prior learning assessment, where we actually go about documenting all these experiences and the learning that would have been acquired as a result of the experiences in accordance with something what we will call a national standard. And in some instances, may actually be with the regional standard, right? So at this particular point, all the persons who actually would have more or less fall into this particular category, and for whatever reason, they may not have been afforded this formal opportunity to be certified formally for their particular occupational area. This is now a new avenue that we're actually trying to put forward where they can now get back into the mainstream of education and training. So in terms of the actual process itself, it's a very basic, simple process. It's a 6 to 7 stage process in terms of the actual process itself covers everything from the application going through to the person in terms of ensuring that the person is actually viable for the process, and then working with that person in terms of evidence collection, working towards the actual assessment of the person, right? Within the process, there's a certain level of quality assurance mechanisms that actually have been put in place to ensure that once a decision is made, that this person is competent. And that's what we actually say in this particular system. It's not about passing or failing. The person is either deemed competent by the assessor, which is the first line of the quality assurance mechanism, or not yet competent. In this particular instance, once that person is deemed competent, we would more or less be assured that that person would have gone through the various rigors in terms of documenting everything that is required in accordance with the actual occupational standard. So, as Mr. John spoke about in terms of institutions coming on board, in terms of now trying to help us facilitate this actual process. There are a lot of institutions that we actually work with under the Ministry of Education that offer different aspects of the TVET program, whether it be from the training perspective or the actual assessment perspective, that we actually would be working with to now help facilitate these assessments. Right, MIC, the Institute of Technology, will actually be one of the institutions, together with maybe institutions like YTEP and NESC, just to name a few. Right. So in terms of the actual access, I know people will be asking, so how do I get on board in terms of this actual process? The first thing is that once you have an expressed interest in terms of getting yourself assessed and certified, is that you actually may be coming to the actual Tobago NTA office, where someone actually walk you through that particular first stage of the process, where we try to get to actually know you to see that, one, that you have enough evidence to support your particular claim. And once this is so, then the person will actually walk you through the various other steps to get you to that particular point where we'll now be ready to facilitate the assessment leading to that formal recognition by way of certification. So, Mr. John, can you actually give any examples of where this would have worked for any persons that we would have dealt with in Tobago so far?
Yes, certainly. Over the years, we would have done some element of PLAR, and there was a small group of persons up at the Patients Hill Center. Right. Of course, they would have gone through the process and would have been certified. And coming out of that, they would have been making themselves more marketable, would have had promotion in their jobs, or would have sought jobs with the CVQ qualification. Excellent. Because it's a valid qualification. In addition, the CVQ allows portability throughout the Caribbean. Excellent. And that allows persons to challenge for jobs outside of Trinidad and Tobago with that qualification. Let us hasten to say also that the PLAR, although relatively new to Trinidad and Tobago, is a tested and tried process internationally. It is used for licensing purposes. In Canada, for example, the famous Red Seal examination can be challenged for you to get an electrical license. And it is also used by some universities to offer, let's just say, credits for persons who would have acquired learning, anyhow they would have, so that they can reduce the length of their program and, of course, cost as well. So that this has international testing. Excellent. And it brings to bear another opportunity for persons in the TVET environment to be certified and building the capacity, the intellectual capacity of and the workforce of Tobago in particular.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. John. I also wanted us maybe take another perspective in terms of talking about the type of individuals that will most likely come through this particular process. Now, you have a lot of persons who, for example, because of maybe opportunities wasn't really made available to them in different occupational areas, but yet they had maybe a family member who may have had a certain skill, a certain business, and then afford that person now to work with them for a certain number of years, and they themselves would have acquired the actual skill sets. This is the type of individual that we're actually looking for coming towards this particular process, because what you're going to find is that the beauty about this particular system is that it's modular in nature in terms of certification. You can either be awarded what we will call unit awards, or you will get enough. If you get enough of the unit awards, you'll actually get the overall qualification. So for any particular occupational area, let's say masonry, carpentry, electrical installation, whether it be cosmetology, data operation, business administration, once there's an occupational standard that exists and we actually have the resource requirements in terms of being able to facilitate that assessment, we actually can now help you get to that particular point of recognition, which will be that formal certification for that process. Now, people may be actually thinking about, so what are the benefits of this thing? For a lot of the persons, as we keep mentioning during our discussion so far, a lot of these persons for the first time in their lives would now be able to receive some formal credential for what they would have been doing for most of their lives. And they actually would have been very successful at it because people would be asking them to do different jobs. So that was one of the big things. For those persons, they would now be formally certified. They would now have what they would call the paper certification to support what they do on a regular basis. From this, there's a host of other opportunities that will actually now present itself. In terms of persons who may be working for companies, now there's an opportunity, for even promotion. Sometimes what actually happens as well, persons will now start thinking about what they can actually do, not only for now, but maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Now that they have actually been certified, and this has now opened their appetite in terms of what the possibilities might be in terms of education and training, they would now start to look at life from a different perspective. You also have the opportunity in this particular process, because of the fact that we use a standard, whether it be national or regional, as I mentioned before, and in the instance, just in case I didn't mention it before, the national qualification is actually called the Trinidad and Tobago National Vocational Qualification. Its regional counterpart is called the CVQ, which is the Caribbean Vocational Qualification. Now, as I said before, both qualifications are modular in nature. So whatever you can demonstrate, whatever we can document, this is actually what you can be certified for, right? What we also want to be careful of in terms of this particular instance is that in instances where when we do the initial screening of the persons coming forward, and if for whatever reason there may not be that let's say, in terms of sufficiency, the required amount of evidence required to support that person's claim, in this particular instance, what we would like to do is then maybe talk to that person from the perspective of showing them, well, there may be training opportunities that may be available to them, which they can now acquire the same qualification, but just not through the PLAR process. So PLAR distinctly would, in this particular instance, be dealing with the persons who would have had that long period of time in terms of exposure, and they would have been learning as they go along their different years in terms of being in the occupational area and performing. And now we want to document that in accordance with the standard to bring them to this particular point. So in terms of the actual, one of the other benefits that you can actually get from the actual process itself is the ability now to see yourself in terms of strengths and weaknesses. Now, as an electrician, you can know, all right, I have been certified for these particular areas, but I can also now acquire these other things. If I maybe go and do an additional course of study, that would now bring me up to this particular point. So these are some of the benefits that we're actually looking at in terms of the actual documentation. So what I actually want to talk about as well is the fact that in terms of this particular process, we are actually now trying to be flexible in terms of allowing persons to come forward and have themselves assessed and certified, in the sense that we have to accept that education and training is changing over the years. It's not the traditional classroom type of environment where you have to go to a particular institution and stay there for a certain period of time and therefore acquire all the knowledge, the abilities, and the attitudes that actually go with that particular area. What is actually happening is that persons actually still learn in different ways, and therefore we have to recognize this learning that happens outside the formal sector. And PLAR is a process that actually caters to this. So what you would see happening in a lot of instances is that these persons now would have acquired, as I say, their skills through non-formal, informal means, where they would now have either work with somebody through a apprenticeship type system, and over the years they would have acquired these skills. So I'm hoping that, as we keep going over certain points, that you keep hearing the common factor, in the sense that, what we're trying to do is actually make certification flexible for these persons, because the society will have already tested these persons and already deemed them competent, because they keep coming back to get the jobs done. We have the mechanics, we have all the electricians who help service the different sections in terms of our society. So what we're trying to do is to ensure that these persons are well accounted for within our education and training system, and therefore that they know that the other opportunities that may be available to them, it now becomes clear as they become certified and move forward. So in terms of the actual assessment itself, what we have to ensure when we actually collect evidence, we have to ensure that in terms of the various factors that go together in terms of ensuring that the process is a very rigorous process in terms of documentation, that there is sufficiency in terms of the information, in terms of the evidence being collected. It's valid evidence, it's authentic, and it's reliable in terms of the factor that when a decision is made to deem this person competent, the evidence itself should, even if it's 5 years from now and they look back at it, that assessor should come up to that very same judgment. Now, in terms of how the assessments can actually take place, there is an opportunity, and I know in Tobago this may actually work well, where, and Mr. John can actually hear me out on this, where if it is that we don't have a formalized institution that actually would now help us facilitate the actual assessments, there's an actual possibility where we would now set everything up together with maybe the assessors and the other key resource personnel, where we can now come in the field and work with persons to now help document the evidence as required to get them to that particular point. So, Mr. John, I think it also gives some ideas in terms of how that might actually work out.
And I think that's a very, very good point. When you talk, you spoke earlier on of the advantages, benefits of this PLAR,
Right.
and in this certification. Right. In Tobago, you do have, as far as my knowledge goes, you do have a lot of small businesses.
Right.
Somebody has a hairdressing salon.
Right.
And that person, you could well imagine what would happen if somebody walks in and sees in the back of this establishment, just sitting over the hairdresser, a CVQ qualification saying that they have this qualification to back up their claim as an hairdresser. It puts their business in a better position. And so that would be one of the benefits. But that same hairdressing salon becomes the place where the assessment can take place if there isn't a formal institution. So there are loads of opportunities where the system is that flexible to accommodate the different modes or different direction in which the assessment could take place.
Excellent. So just adding again onto this, in terms of the methods that actually could be used, what we try to actually ensure is that there's a certain triangulation in terms of the effort that's put forward in terms of deeming that person competent. So the flexibility actually comes into being is that for every single person that's going to come through the process, the PLAR actually, or the assessment methods will actually be now geared towards that person in terms of their needs, their requirements to get them to that particular point. So what we try to do is at least use at least 3 of the methodologies that is prescribed. You also have the situation where persons may be coming forward with deficiencies, whether it be literacy, numeracy, or whatever it is. Now, there's an opportunity, while we still would recommend that those persons seek additional help in terms of addressing some of these areas, there's still an opportunity for whatever work that they do that maybe requires them maybe not to go into that in depth in terms of the literacy and numeracy, whatever it is that they can document, whatever we can put forward and they can demonstrate. This could actually still go forward in terms of them being assessed and certified at that particular level, at least for those unit awards. Yeah. Right. So in this particular instance, that's part of the flexibility. That's also a part of the system. So coming back in terms of how the persons could actually get access. Now, once it is that you're actually available or you want to present yourself to come forward for the actual assessment, there's a certain level of commitment that's actually required to go through the process. And that means that you will now have to work with someone within either the institution or the NTA in terms of now the evidence collection process. And what we usually try to guide persons to do is to build what we call a professional portfolio. Now, this is similar to what you would have like persons who would come around to you, let's say to do like a person who does tile work coming to your house to say, well, look, this is what I would have done for certain persons around the street, and they would have a showcase type portfolio. What we will want you to help the person do in this particular point, which will now help us in terms of assessing and certifying them, is to ensure that they can document everything that they would have been doing over the years and the learning that would have taken place, together with the fact that we can now have a verifiable point where we can now call and maybe talk to persons who would have actually been a part of the process. So this would actually go a long way in terms of getting that person towards this point of assessment and recognition by way of certification. So there's that opportunity as well. Mr. John, in terms of the possibilities, in terms of how technology plays a part, I know technology is changing. Can you say in terms of how a PLAR would actually now also help in an instance like that?
Well, there are two things that it identify gaps in what's happening. And the whole process of PLAR is not significantly different from a formal institution. Okay. A formal institution, perhaps with an instructor my age group, could also suffer from teaching outdated skills and knowledge. Right. But you have standards that are developed by experts, and industry have an input into those standards so that the standards are current. So when one maps themselves against those standards and say, yes, that person is competent, it means then that the person is in keeping with the technology as the technology changes.
As is required
in that particular point and that discipline. And in fact, in some discipline, the half-life of the technology is shorter. So you may have a situation where a discipline, let's say, for example, masonry is not changing as fast as a discipline, let's say, like electrical installation. Or even ICT. Like ICT, for that matter. So that each discipline has its own dispensation. But the safeguard against all that is predicated by the recency of the standards that are developed.
Right.
Standards are developed locally, regionally, and they are developed with industry input. And industry is the one that says, this is what we do.
Right.
And if industry is saying this is what we do, it stands to reason. And they are part of establishing the standards. It means that the people who put themselves for that certification and are deemed competent in keeping with the technology of the time.
Excellent. Yeah. So what you're actually hearing is the fact that no matter the particular occupation area, once there's technological changes, the standards has to keep abreast of these changes, and therefore the persons that are being certified, although we say prior learning that we're really trying to document here, it has to be that consistent upgrading of that skill and knowledge requirement as they go along over the years. Otherwise, the person would not really be learning. Whatever they learned back in the first year of performance, that's what they will continue to do the next few years. Yeah. And this, we want to make this distinction. This is not what we're actually looking at in PLAR. We have to show that the person would have been learning over the years, and therefore, once they learn as let's say a carpenter, they learn how to hold one of the hammers. They would know, all right, there's a certain way to grip a tool. There's a certain application in terms of how to use that tool to deliver the amount of force. We want to see that the person would actually have learned that over the period of years, and therefore there will be change from year to year, even as they introduce more technology, as they do different jobs, and it gets more and more complex, that they can actually grow with it as well. Mm-hmm. So you'll see that in terms of their critical thinking as well. Yeah. And this is all well documented in the standards. Mr. John said we work with industry experts. The NTA doesn't do it in isolation. We actually work with the industry experts to develop these standards. And therefore, this is the guide the assessors would actually have in terms of trying to now document what this person would have been doing over the years, the learning that would have taken place, and therefore make that recommendation to deem that person at that particular point either competent, or in instances where there may not be sufficient evidence, they will be deemed not yet competent. But at least at this particular point, you'll be given enough information to tell you what you need to do in order to get you to that particular point to come forward for certification.
Exactly.
So one of the other things that I just wanted to touch on is in terms of the actual, what happens to that person post-certification. Now, as I said before, for a lot of persons who actually coming through this particular route, this is the first time a lot of things will now start to open up to them. Institutions or programs that they didn't think that they would actually be able to join or get into before, this is now an opportunity where they may now be accepted. So what we try to do as a part of the process as well, we don't just leave the person just at the certification standpoint. Through the institutions, like the one that Mr. John would represent, or NESC and YTEP and all the other institutions who may actually operate as workforce assessment centers, what we're trying to do is to ensure that there's a holistic approach in terms of getting that person to the next step. So having gone through the actual assessment, documentation, and the certification factor, this group of individuals will now work with this person to say, well, look, this is where you are in terms of your strengths and your weaknesses. And these are the opportunities that actually will be available to you, where you can now go forward to maybe acquire new skill sets that will get us to this particular point. So this is just one of the other things I want to touch on in terms of that ability, the flexibility in terms of the actual process to get us to that next level. Mr. John, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add in terms of the actual process itself.
Well, you spoke earlier on about triangulation, and there's also the opportunity to challenge an examination that is set at a particular level based on those standards, which is not dissimilar from, and I keep referring to, because people will think, okay, this is a gimmick. It is not different from, so much different. It's just that the process, the way you acquire it is different. It recognizes prior learning. But in a sense, a formal institution also recognizes prior learning.
Yes.
You go to do a 4-year degree or 4-year program in an institution. It starts at some point. And there is a curriculum that you follow. And that curriculum is predicated on some industrial need. And that curriculum sets itself up for revision every so many years. But that becomes the basis, and the assessment will attest to the fact whether you have learned enough to be competent or not. No different.
Excellent.
We are just acknowledging a new avenue, another avenue, acknowledging that learning takes place outside of formal institution.
Excellent.
And you want to recognize that, give people credit for that, and they're either competent or not competent.
Right. So I just want to take a point out of that in terms of talking about the quality assurance mechanisms that are actually put in place, because a lot of persons may be saying, well, how this kind of sounds too good to be true.
Yeah.
All right. So you can actually just walk up to an institution like an NTA or MIC and say, look, I want to be assessed and certified, and all of a sudden I'm competent. So what I want to ensure is that everyone is aware of how this thing actually works out in terms of the assessor being the first line of that quality assurance mechanism. Once the assessor makes that decision, the assessor is responsible for collecting all this evidence in accordance with the standard, and that decision is actually made at that particular point. The person gets feedback at that particular point to say they are deemed competent or not yet competent, and they know what they have to do in the areas where they are deemed not yet competent. Beyond that particular point, there's also an internal verifier that's a part of the quality assurance mechanism that's a part of this particular process. In this particular instance, that person is now going to verify the work on the assessment in terms of the evidence that was collected and the decision that was made to ensure that it's consistent with that outcome. Right? Beyond that particular point, where the NT would now come into play, maybe as the awarding part of the function, is where we have external verification. This is where we will get this external expert to now go over all the information as presented. And again, they're double checking to make sure that this thing is consistent with the outcome, to ensure that maybe if in instances where there may be insufficient evidence, that is rectified before this goes forward. Because you see, one of the things that we have to be careful of in this particular process, as I say, it kind of sounds too good to be true, but we have to ensure within a competency-based system, when you get a competency-based certificate, that you are truly competent. We cannot afford for persons to actually now come forward without the correct prerequisites in terms of that evidence, and therefore be deemed competent and be given that certificate. This would mean a terrible thing in terms of going forward for everybody who's to come after that, because it would now put a level of it would break down the integrity factor in terms of the actual certificate that persons would actually be able achieving at this particular point. So in terms of the actual process, I just want to recap in terms of how the process actually works. We will actually work, and when I say we, the institutions, whether it be that or the NTA, will actually now work with the individuals to get you to this particular point. So once there's an expressed interest, we would walk you through the process in terms of developing your portfolio, bringing the evidence forward. There will actually be an opportunity for you to actually now liaise with the actual assessor, who is the expert in this particular instance, and they would now walk through what is the correct assessment method or scenario for you. If it is that we now have to set or facilitate the actual assessment, which is going to be done in the field or in someone's workplace, this is something that we also would have to work through in terms of what are the the health and safety requirements, the logistical requirements in terms of getting this done as well. So what you're hearing is that, we will actually have somebody working with you to get you to this particular point. And that's the level of the flexibility in terms of the actual process and the system. All right. So in terms of some of the things that actually we expect to see when we build a portfolio. Now, if persons would have taken pictures of work that they would have done, and hopefully in terms of when you're taking the photographs, it actually includes a before, during, and after, so you could actually see the progression as the person goes along. We look forward to these things actually being included into your portfolios. Anything like work records, skill validation, performance appraisal, training records, even course outlines for programs that you would have done in the past. Now, I know Mr. John may be able to speak to this as well, because he mentioned John D. and San Fernando Tech, and a lot of persons coming through the NEC program. There are actually persons outside there who would have done the course of study, and therefore they may not have received the full qualification or any certification as a result. This is also a perfect avenue for them to come forward, to now have this set of learning that would have taken place, and together with the skills that they would have acquired post that actual learning, to now be taken into consideration and therefore be part of the process in terms of getting them assessed and certified. Could you just talk about do you know any examples of persons like in that and Tobago? Because I know persons from Tobago used to have to go to Trinidad to actually do certain NEC programs.
Right. And that is true, and there were sprinkling of evening classes that started in Tobago
Right.
under companies, and one would recall, let's say, for the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission.
Right.
And such institutions would have had as part of their own framework that the apprentices would attend the technical school.
Right.
And in the absence of that in Tobago, they would have set up their own system that would teach these subjects. Not everybody who attempted them would be successful.
Right.
And therefore you would have people who would have acquired some knowledge and skills, and again work in the environment.
Right.
So there's the acquisition of all these skills over the years in situations like that. And then I know the community development, for example, run these programs in different villages, electrical, masonry, plumbing, and so on. And there's also that opportunity. That doesn't lead in itself to a certification,
Right.
but also to some knowledge of the thing and also some practice.
Excellent.
And when you juxtapose that against the learning environment or the wider learning environment, which is the working environment,
Right.
you have a solid person who is good, but lacks certification.
Right. I know this will be a major stumbling block in terms of this person
Precisely.
getting different opportunities, which would be afforded the other persons who would be otherwise certified and working in the environment.
And
So-
that is very pervasive in Tobago, where you do not have so much opportunities,
Right.
but also a lot of learning is taking place and there is no certification.
It's not accounted for
And it's
properly.
not accounted for.
All right, so no problem. So just going back again in terms of the actual process, one of the things that we want to work with in the process is actually the ability for the person to bring forward evidence. Now, persons are going to ask, how long is this process going to actually take? And the truth is, or the truth lies in the fact that, as much as the person can actually bring the evidence forward, develop the portfolio and work with us in the process, we can actually get this done within an 8-week, let's say, turnaround period. And that's actually getting them to the point of assessment. Now, the thing that actually takes a lot of time is where the persons don't have that evidence coming forward. But at the same time, we're not going to stop the person from basically coming forward. We're going to try to use another method to get them to that particular point of assessment and certification. So that's why we said the process is very flexible. But at the same time, we're not overly flexible where evidence is not being collected. We have to ensure that these persons have enough evidence. However it is, at the end of it all, even if the person doesn't have a portfolio come forward, we're going to ensure that they leave the process with a portfolio.
Right.
Of all the evidence that we would have collected, that person would have that going forward. So we want to encourage trade persons, professionals within the field to actually document all the learning that takes place as they go along their normal work. In terms of the actual opportunities for the persons now to, let's say, enter different courses of study. Now, PLAR could be used in different ways. And I also want to mention this little part, just before maybe we handle a couple of questions. The fact that a lot of institutions can actually use the PLAR process now to streamline the persons that are coming into their program. So gone are the days where, you're going to have people coming through and having to start from ground zero. To say, well, look, I need to do everything over again, because these are working persons and they would have acquired certain skill sets as they work within different environments, and therefore this should be taken into consideration. And a lot of institutions are actually using the process to now streamline persons to like-minded type groupings, where they can now have persons of doing what they call modular studies, going forward for assessment and certification. So this is another application where you can actually see PLAR now trying to help persons, especially in the environment like what we would have had existing in Tobago, going forward in terms of education and training. Now, I think at this particular point, we may be ready to handle questions within a little bit. So what I also just want to, is there any other things that you would want to summarize in terms of your perspective, in terms of the institution that you represent as well going forward, in terms of things that we're looking to do to come on stream?
Yeah, well, I'm quite comfortable with the amount of information we disseminated.
Right.
Just now it's just to invite some questions so that we know who is on the next side of the dialogue.
Right.
And that will give us an idea, that feedback, whether we would have served our purpose
Good.
or not. And of course, clear up any misunderstandings of where we are at.
Excellent. Just before I get to this particular point, though, while I know they're getting the questions coming along, there's one other thing that I need to discuss in terms of the cost factor. There is a cost that actually has to be incurred in terms of the assessment process going forward. And for most, what you will call, we work with the qualification framework, and most persons, let's say at the craft level, who are at the level 2 occupational level, this particular assessment in that occupational area, whatever it is, whether it be cosmetology, going straight back to electrical installation, to plumbing, to carpentry, masonry, once it's a level 2 qualification, the cost that's pegged at that is $3,550. And that would take into consideration every single thing that we talk about in terms of facilitating the process, getting you to that point of the actual certificate in your hand. So that means getting the assessors, getting the internal verifiers, the external verifiers, the whole documentation, facilitating the process, processing of the certificate to get you to that particular point. Now, all the other areas, whether it be level 3 and above, what we will actually like to do is then be able to talk to that person to work out how we're actually going to get this thing done. Because while we mentioned that may be the cost, it also represents the starting point, maybe depending on the occupational area, what we really have to incur as a cost going forward for that particular area. So we always encourage persons to come forward and get the information, so that we'll be willing to work with you to get you to that particular point. So at this particular point, I think we kind of open to any question. I think there was a question in terms of how the technology.
Okay, before we get there, I want to thank Mr. Lafon and Mr. John for such an insightful and interesting presentation, and for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. Also for acknowledging that learning takes place outside of formal education, and the process, the flexibility of the prior learning assessment and recognition process. So we really want to thank you for that. The first question comes from Dr. Subran. Are attaining levels in troubleshooting and problem solving assessed in PLAR? That's the first question.
Yeah, that's good.
Are attaining levels in troubleshooting and problem solving assessed in PLAR?
Once the standard actually specifies that this is a requirement, all levels of critical thinking and all those other things that troubleshooting, fault finding, all of these things that are actually a part of the actual process, this is actually what is actually going to be assessed. So in this particular instance, the questioner was actually asked if it is included. Once it is specified in the standard and is a requirement for that particular occupational area, it has and it will be assessed and documented going forward for the actual recognition.
But I also would want to say, and it goes back to what was established earlier on, the industry determines who or what it wants. And the industry participates in the establishment of the standard. And as my colleague is saying, my friend here is saying, if that troubleshooting is a requirement, and then it's a requirement, and that person. And additionally, we spoke to establishing an assessment, a practical assessment, akin to what the standards require. And or the person who pursues this qualification has the opportunity to challenge that examination, inclusive of whether they are troubleshooting standards or whatever, or whichever technology is applied based on the standards, which is no different as we established. The standards become the guiding point. As in a formal institution, your curriculum becomes the guiding point, and your curriculum has to be relevant, so are the standards.
I think Mr. John actually made a good point there in the sense that this cannot be any different from what you would have in an institution where training is actually taking place. So if troubleshooting is a requirement in terms of that person acquiring that skill, it has to be a part of the operational mode of that person in terms of the standard as well. So yes, it will be assessed and documented.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another question from our viewers. Is the training system in Tobago truly ready to take advantage of PLAR? What is the biggest hurdle likely to be faced with PLAR in Tobago? Mr. John, I think you...
Yeah, well, over the years, even in our practical lives, we tend not to document stuff. Documentation has always been and will always be a challenge for most of us, and that is not for persons who are in any situation. It also includes persons who are looking for evidence to see what they would have done. So documentation would be. And what we can do to accommodate and to facilitate that is to make a test or an assessment available to such persons which is at that level. If the person claims and have some evidence that they have been practicing over the years but cannot show what they have actually done, then we can build a test, right, that will evaluate what they would have or assess what they would have done. And one of the biggest hurdles again would be
Resources.
the resources. Technical vocational education and training requires a lot of resources. That will be one of the challenges. But the fact that this program is coming to bear in Tobago means that there's a willingness to provide the resources. Over time, Rome wasn't built in a day, and if it was, then I'm not aware of that Rome. So that we can have a nice process by which we would have the system going. And then you will have gradually, as it picks up, people will take advantage of it. But there will be some challenges.
Again, just to add on to it, I would like to say that I think Tobago is at that particular point. We have seen Tobago, in the years that people come across from Trinidad, you will see a lot of changes taking place. The technologies across here, so I'm not saying anything to say, it's going to hold us back. There are going to be challenges, as Mr. John said, but it's not anything that is going to stop a person from coming forward, especially in a process like this, where we can now go to wherever you're working and actually try to facilitate this process. So I think the time is now, the time is right. We really want to encourage persons to become assessed and certified.
It also put a little plug in that would encourage those people who have certification and experience to make themselves available through the NTA to become assessors. Because that internal verifiers, which are, personnel that are required by the process. So it gives opportunities for people to make extra buck. When they are good accessors, the NTA will certainly use them as an external verifier, and institutions can use them for their own purposes.
And we're also talking about making the system sustainable. Yeah. So if it is that we don't have to bring persons from Trinidad to assess persons in Tobago, we don't have to take persons from Tobago to bring them to Trinidad to get them assessed and certified. This is why you're talking about creating that sustainable model. So the more persons that could actually come forward, as Mr. John is actually saying in this particular instance, this is actually what we're looking to do, to develop that system to that sustainable model.
Excellent. You would have spoken about the development of standards. Another question we have from our viewers: do standard developers visit and observe practitioners at work, or do they rely solely on contributions given by industry representatives when updating the standards?
In this particular instance, I would like to say at the NTA, we actually have to, from time to time, we work with industry associations, sector advisory committees, and there will be the opportunity from time to time to go in for the more complex type of occupational standards development. It has to be like that, because sometimes you cannot sit down in an abstract location and just say that you're going to create an industry-specific already standard. So in a particular instance like that, we will actually now work with the industry experts, and wherever the need is, where there's a need in terms of them going out into the field, the persons who actually specialize, the specialists in these areas, will actually go out to the industry to see how these things are actually being done, to ensure that when something is documented as part of the standard, it's actually consistent with what is actually happening in the industry. And remember, as well, these things also has to be ratified in terms of going around for the industry acceptance. So there is that opportunity from industry experts to now say, well, look, what you put in the standard is actually relevant to us, and this makes sense, and therefore we support this going forward.
By the way, when we use the term industry, it means practitioners. So an industry is not represented by who, so says Inga. An industry is the people who work in the place. So that when we say industry, those are the people, the SMEs, the experts who work in the area.
Yes.
So, if they say that's what it is, that's what it is, because you have a volume of industry experts. Additionally to what my friend here is saying, you do have the people within the NTA who will from time to time make a wider verification of what was submitted by the industry.
Right, excellent.
Because of technological developments, ICT in particular, work techniques have changed radically in many occupations over the past decade. How can PLAR certification be valid in assessing prior learning when the learning might well be irrelevant in today's workplace?
All right. I would start off, and I know Mr. John is just beaming to answer this particular one as well. As I said before, in terms of the evidence collection, it has to have that currency factor. We have to ensure that although it was prior learning, that is still relevant to what is applicable for that operation today. So therefore, the standards actually, as Mr. John mentioned as well, is also being reviewed on a certain time period. All standards, depending on the occupational area, would have their specified time periods as to which they were reviewed. So therefore, the requirements would now be very closely aligned to the technological advances that take place in most industries or most occupational areas.
Yeah, ICT is mentioned, but prior is not a dispensation. Prior means it was learned before by some other method. And so, it begs the question, because you have the standards and the standards are revised, it's quite obvious the standards will capture. And in any occupation or any profession, you would have changes that are taken more rapid, and that takes care of itself in a sense, because when I go by a doctor who looks like me, I don't ask him, let me see your recent qualification. You understand, you are anticipating that the doctor will develop himself over time. But at the time when the certificate is issued, it's issued against standards that are relevant to that dispensation or that period.
Perfect.
Great. In terms of assessment, someone asked a question, are group projects used in the PLAR assessment exercise in electrical installation, for example?
Group projects?
Yes.
PLAR is an individual-based process. We cannot give a group project and assess everybody equally. There's no way to determine the competencies that are actually displayed or the inputs from each person to determine what level of competency. This is actually done on an individual basis, and I want to make that clear. The persons that come forward, you're not going to be asked to work in a group of persons. You shouldn't be asked to work in a group of persons. What is actually going to happen in this particular instance is that you would now be put through your paces. If it is that that job function requires an assistant, that is what will be afforded to you at that particular point. But the assistant is not part of the assessment process. It is you that is actually going to be assessed in accordance with the requirements for the standard. So I hope that's where the perspective that person is coming from. So this is what we actually want to ensure, that when we document something, it is consistent for that individual, and therefore we give that individual the correct certificate in accordance with what can be demonstrated by that individual and not a group.
Very good.
Excellent. We'll take our last question. With notably limited opportunities for advanced training, how would candidates be able to fill the gaps in their learning?
It's a fantastic question. We are at a point in terms of where technology is rapidly going. We are beyond the verge in terms of where 5G is now going to become the norm. And what this actually represents for information transfer, for technological transfer, for procedural transfer, it is fantastic, and it's actually mind-boggling to a certain aspect. So what I'm actually trying to say, people are learning in different ways right now. There are nail technicians who are actually looking at YouTube videos and becoming very competent at what they actually do. They're doing it over and over, that practice, and they're learning different techniques. There are universities right now that are actually applying themselves, or different technical institutions as well, online, where they're actually showing persons working on hybrid vehicles, robotics, things with artificial intelligence. So learning is actually, and educational training is actually taking a big leap forward. So I think what I would like to maybe, the perspective I would like to put forward for this person is that they should now look at what is actually happening in terms of educational training throughout the world. Because we're now part of this bigger, larger village where information transfer is not as it used to be, where you used to have to pull an encyclopedia or a couple of encyclopedias or a library book to actually determine how to get things done. We are now at the realm where information is readily available. Once you search, you can actually get that through institutions, accredited institutions, viable institutions where they would now have all the procedures, all the technology, and everything that's required to get certain things done. So I think that's the angle I would like to take for this particular question. I know Mr. John wants to.
Yeah, I subscribe to what you said, and then even within the limited number of technical institutions in Tobago, you can still go into the institution and ask the question, what's offered, what do I have,
Right.
and what is required, and what are the opportunities. So you still have that opportunity in addition to what you have said. Yeah.
Right. So you see, the market that you're actually dealing with is no longer just what is Tobago, is actually what's available online as well. So you can now supplement whatever is available here locally in Tobago, and therefore now build yourself or your competencies now to the required level to get you to that next step.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for participating in and viewing the webinar. Most of all, special thanks to our two presenters, Mr. Lafon and Mr. John, for being here. God bless.